Orphan girl hides a picture in her book. What the staff finds leaves them speechless. Mia was a quiet child, the kind of girl who could blend into the background without effort. At 8 years old, she already seemed far older than her years, her large, solemn eyes holding secrets that no one at the orphanage could quite unravel. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then her answers were brief, almost clipped, as though words were a precious resource she couldn't afford to waste. The staff at Oakwood Orphanage had grown used to Mia's quiet ways. Unlike some of the other children, who wore their emotions on their sleeves and sought attention wherever they could find it, Mia preferred the company of books. She would spend hours in the small, dusty library tucked away at the back of the orphanage, poring over novels far beyond her age range. She had a particular fondness for old, worn-out volumes, the kind with cracked spines and yellowed pages that smelled faintly of time itself. It wasn't unusual to find Mia curled up in one of the library's threadbare armchairs, her knees tucked to her chest as she immersed herself in a world far removed from her own. To the untrained eye, she appeared lost in the stories, completely absorbed. But over time, the staff began to notice something peculiar. At first, it was subtle, so subtle that most wouldn't have picked up on it. When Mia returned her books to the library, small items would sometimes fall out from between the pages: a pressed flower, a scrap of ribbon, or a tiny drawing on the back of an orphanage flyer. Mrs. Carter, the librarian, had been the first to notice, though she hadn't mentioned it to anyone right away. "Kids will be kids," she muttered to herself the first time she found a daisy, its petals flattened and dried, tucked neatly into a book about explorers. She assumed it was a one-time thing, a child's whimsical way of marking a page. But as the weeks went on, the discoveries became more frequent and more deliberate. A strand of yarn, carefully tied into a bow, slipped from the pages of a book about fairy tales. A small piece of paper, folded into a crude origami crane, was nestled between the chapters of a historical novel. Mrs. Carter found herself intrigued, and though she tried to dismiss it as a harmless habit, she couldn't help but wonder what Mia was trying to say with these hidden trinkets. One rainy afternoon, Mrs. Carter decided to approach Mia directly. The girl was sitting at her usual spot in the library, her dark hair falling into her eyes as she hunched over a book about ancient myths. The rain pattered softly against the windows, filling the quiet room with a soothing rhythm. "Mia," Mrs. Carter began, her voice gentle, "can I talk to you for a moment?" Mia looked up, her expression unreadable. She nodded silently and closed her book, her small hands resting lightly on the cover. Mrs. Carter sat down in the chair opposite her, smoothing her skirt as she leaned forward. "I've noticed something," she said. "When you return your books, I sometimes find little surprises tucked inside. Flowers, ribbons, things like that. Are you the one leaving them?" Mia's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. Instead, she gave a small nod, her eyes wary but steady. "Why do you do it?" Mrs. Carter asked, keeping her tone light and curious. Mia hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. "Because," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "books should keep memories." Mrs. Carter blinked, taken aback by the unexpected response. "Memories?" Mia nodded again, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I don't have anywhere else to put them." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Carter felt a pang in her chest as she realized what Mia was saying. In a life filled with instability and loss, the books had become Mia's way of holding onto the fragments of herself. The small items she left behind were more than trinkets, they were pieces of her story, tucked away where they couldn't be lost. From that day on, Mrs. Carter began paying closer attention to Mia's library habits. She didn't confront the girl about the items again, but she made a point to catalog them, wondering if they might hold clues to Mia's past. Each time Mia returned a book, Mrs. Carter would carefully examine the pages, noting the placement and type of item she found. Over time, a pattern began to emerge. The items Mia hid seemed to grow more personal. One day, Mrs. Carter found a delicate piece of lace, frayed at the edges, tucked into a book about castles. Another day, a faded ticket stub from a local carnival appeared in a mystery novel. But it wasn't until Mrs. Carter discovered the photograph that she began to suspect there was something more at play. The photograph was small and creased, its edges worn from years of handling. It depicted a family of three: a man, a woman, and a young girl with dark hair and solemn eyes. They were standing in front of a house with a red door, their smiles bright despite the faded colors of the image. Mrs. Carter's heart ached as she realized the girl in the photograph was Mia. She held the photograph carefully, her mind racing with questions. Where had it come from? Was it the only picture Mia had of her family? And why had she chosen to hide it in the pages of a book? Mrs. Carter knew she couldn't keep the discovery to herself. That evening, she brought the photograph to Mrs. Reynolds, the orphanage director, and explained what she had found. "I think this might be a clue to Mia's past," Mrs. Carter said, placing the photograph on Mrs. Reynolds' desk. "I don't know if she wants us to find it or if she's just trying to keep it safe, but I thought you should see it." Mrs. Reynolds picked up the photograph, her brow furrowing as she studied it. "It's definitely Mia," she said, "but I don't recognize the adults. They must be her parents. Do we have any records of her family?" Mrs. Carter asked. Mrs. Reynolds shook her head. "Mia came to us when she was 5. The social worker who brought her said she'd been found at a bus station, but they couldn't locate any next of kin. She hasn't talked about her family since." Mrs. Carter sighed, her heart heavy. "Do you think we should ask her about the photograph?" Mrs. Reynolds hesitated. "We have to be careful," she said. "Mia's been through so much already. If she's not ready to talk, we can't push her. But maybe we can try to learn more on our own." Over the next few days, Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds worked together to piece together what little information they had about Mia's past. They contacted the social worker who had handled her case, hoping to uncover more details about the circumstances that had brought her to the orphanage. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter continued to observe Mia, watching for any signs that the girl was ready to open up. Mia, for her part, seemed unaware of the staff's efforts. She continued her quiet routine, spending hours in the library and leaving behind her little treasures. But there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, an almost imperceptible lightness in her step, as though she sensed that something was changing. One afternoon, as Mia sat in her usual spot with a book, Mrs. Carter approached her with a gentle smile. She carried the photograph in her hand, hidden beneath a piece of paper. "Mia," she said softly, "I found something in one of the books you returned. I was wondering if you could tell me about it." Mia looked up, her eyes widening as Mrs. Carter placed the photograph on the table. For a moment, she didn't move, her gaze fixed on the image. Then, slowly, she reached out and picked it up, her small fingers tracing the edges of the worn paper. "It's my family," she said, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Carter's heart clenched. "Do you remember them?" she asked gently. Mia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "A little. I remember the red door." Mrs. Carter felt a pang of sadness as she watched Mia clutch the photograph, her small fingers gripping it as though it might slip away. The girl's eyes, normally so guarded, were soft now, brimming with memories and emotions she had long kept buried. "What do you remember about the red door, Mia?" Mrs. Carter asked gently, leaning forward in her chair. Mia hesitated, her brow furrowing as she searched her thoughts. "It was always warm," she said softly. "In the mornings, the sunlight would hit it and it would glow like fire. Mama said it was our lucky door." Mrs. Carter smiled, imagining the scene Mia had described. "That sounds beautiful. Do you remember anything else about the house?" "There was a garden," Mia continued, her voice growing steadier. "With roses. Mama loved them. She used to let me pick one every week and put it in a vase on the kitchen table." Mrs. Carter's chest tightened. She could picture the life Mia described, simple and full of love, a stark contrast to the lonely days she now spent at the orphanage. But the photograph raised as many questions as it answered. Who were the people in the picture? What had happened to them? And why had Mia ended up at the bus station alone? "We're going to help you find out more about your family," Mrs. Carter said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "If that's something you'd like?" Mia looked up, her eyes searching Mrs. Carter's face. "You mean, you can find them?" "We'll do everything we can," Mrs. Carter promised. "You're not alone in this." Later that evening, Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds pored over the records they had managed to gather from social services. The file on Mia was thin, containing little more than a few reports from the time she had been found. The bus station where she had been discovered was miles away from any residential neighborhoods, and the authorities had been unable to determine how she had gotten there. "There's nothing here about her parents," Mrs. Reynolds said, frustration evident in her tone. "It's like they just vanished." Mrs. Carter nodded, her mind racing. "But we have the photograph now. That's something. If we can identify the house with the red door, it might lead us to more answers." "Do you think she remembers where it was?" Mrs. Reynolds asked. "I'm not sure," Mrs. Carter admitted, "but we can start by asking if she recognizes anything in the photo." The next day, Mrs. Carter approached Mia in the library, where the girl was once again immersed in a book. This time, however, Mia seemed more relaxed, her shoulders less tense than usual. The photograph sat on the table beside her, as though she couldn't bear to part with it. "Mia," Mrs. Carter began, sitting down across from her, "I was wondering if you'd like to tell me more about this picture. Do you remember where it was taken?" Mia tilted her head, studying the photograph. "It was our house," she said. "We used to live there before we moved." "Do you remember where the house was?" Mrs. Carter asked gently. Mia frowned, her fingers tracing the image of the red door. "I think it was near a park," she said. "I used to play on the swings while Mama watched. And there was an ice cream truck that came every afternoon." Mrs. Carter nodded, making a mental note of the details. "That's very helpful, Mia. We're going to see if we can find out where it is." Mia's eyes lit up, a glimmer of hope breaking through her usual guarded demeanor. "Do you think they're still there? Mama and Papa?" Mrs. Carter hesitated, not wanting to give false hope. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we'll do our best to find out." With the new clues, Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds began their search in earnest. They reached out to local historical societies, real estate offices, and even used online databases to look for houses with red doors near parks. It was painstaking work, but they were determined not to give up. After days of searching, Mrs. Carter finally stumbled upon a lead. An old photograph in a local newspaper archive showed a house with a distinctive red door that matched the one in Mia's picture. The accompanying article identified the neighborhood as Chestnut Grove, a small, tight-knit community not far from where Mia had been found. "This has to be it," Mrs. Carter said, her excitement bubbling over as she showed Mrs. Reynolds the article. "It's too similar to be a coincidence." Mrs. Reynolds nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "Let's take Mia there. Maybe seeing it in person will jog her memory." The following Saturday, Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds brought Mia to Chestnut Grove. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with tree-shaded streets and well-kept homes. As they drove past rows of houses, Mia sat in the back seat, her hands clutching the photograph tightly. When they turned onto a small cul-de-sac, Mia gasped, her eyes widening. "That's it," she exclaimed, pointing to a house with a bright red door. Mrs. Carter pulled the car to a stop, her heart pounding. The house looked almost exactly as it did in the photograph, though the garden was overgrown and the paint on the door had begun to peel. They approached cautiously, unsure of what they might find. Knocking on the door, they were met by an elderly woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Klein. She peered curiously at the small group, her eyes softening when she saw Mia. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Klein asked. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, holding the photograph. "We believe this house might be connected to Mia's family. She used to live here. Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Mrs. Klein took the photograph, her brow furrowing as she studied it. "Oh my," she said softly. "I do remember them. They were such a lovely family. But it's been years since they lived here." Mia's face fell, her shoulders slumping. "Do you know where they went?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Klein nodded slowly. "I believe they moved out of state. But I remember the mother. Her name was Elena. She left me a forwarding address in case any mail came for them." Mrs. Carter's heart leaped. "Do you still have it?" Mrs. Klein disappeared into the house and returned a few minutes later with an old address book. She flipped through the pages before handing over a yellowed slip of paper with an address scrawled on it. "Thank you," Mrs. Carter said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means so much to us." Armed with the address, The staff began the next leg of their search. Mia's excitement was palpable, her hope growing stronger with each passing day. Though Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds cautioned her that they couldn't make any guarantees, they, too, felt a flicker of optimism. It wasn't long before they managed to track down a phone number associated with the address. Mrs. Reynolds made the call, her hands trembling slightly as she held the receiver to her ear. "Hello," a woman's voice answered, tentative and cautious. "Hi, my name is Margaret Reynolds," she said. "I'm the director of Oakwood Orphanage. I believe we may have some information about your daughter." The pause on the other end of the line was deafening. Mrs. Reynolds waited, her heart racing as she gripped the receiver. When the voice finally came through again, it was laced with hesitation and disbelief. My daughter?" the woman asked softly, as though the words themselves were too fragile to hold. "I don't understand. Who are you looking for?" "Mia," Mrs. Reynolds said carefully. "She's an 8-year-old girl who came to us a few years ago. We recently found a photograph, and it led us to your address. We believe she might be your daughter." There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by the sound of muffled crying. "Mia," the woman whispered, her voice breaking. "My baby. Is she's alive?" Mrs. Reynolds swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "She's alive and well," she assured the woman. "She's safe here with us." The woman's sobs grew louder, and Mrs. Reynolds could hear someone else in the background asking what was going on. A man's voice, deep and concerned, came through the receiver. "Who is this? What's going on?" "This is Margaret Reynolds, the director of Oakwood Orphanage," she repeated. "I'm speaking to Elena, is it?" "Yes," the woman said through her tears. "I'm Elena. And you have my Mia?" Mrs. Reynolds nodded, though they couldn't see her. "Yes. We found her several years ago, but we had no information about her family. She's been living with us ever since." There was silence again, followed by the sound of Elena gathering herself. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Tell me how to get to her. I need to see her." When Mrs. Reynolds hung up the phone, her hands were still shaking. She turned to Mrs. Carter, who had been anxiously watching the exchange. "It's them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's Mia's parents?" Mrs. Carter let out a sigh of relief, tears welling up in her eyes. "She has parents," she said softly, as though saying it aloud would make it feel more real. "She has a family." The two women wasted no time making arrangements. They agreed to bring Mia's parents to the orphanage the following weekend, giving everyone time to prepare. Mia, of course, was told the news immediately. When Mrs. Reynolds gently explained that they had found her parents, Mia stared at her in stunned silence. Her small hands clutched the photograph, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "Mama? Papa?" "Yes, sweetheart," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice filled with warmth. "They're coming to see you." Tears streamed down Mia's cheeks, and she nodded slowly, her lips forming a small, hesitant smile. "I always knew they'd find me," she said softly. The day of the reunion arrived with a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. The staff at the orphanage worked to make the space warm and welcoming, decorating the common room with flowers and setting out tea and cookies. Mia, dressed in her best dress, a soft lavender one with a lace collar, sat on the couch, clutching the photograph as though it were her lifeline. When the knock came at the door, Mrs. Reynolds and Mrs. Carter exchanged a glance before walking to answer it. Standing on the other side were Elena and her husband, Daniel. Elena's eyes were red from crying, but they lit up the moment she saw Mia sitting in the distance. "Mia," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. She stepped into the room, her hands clasped tightly over her chest. Mia froze for a moment, her wide eyes fixed on the woman before her. Then, slowly, she slid off the couch, the photograph still in her hands. "Mama," she said, her voice small and trembling. Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, my love. It's me." In an instant, Mia ran into her mother's arms, burying her face in Elena's shoulder as she sobbed. "Mama," she cried over and over, the word carrying years of longing and heartbreak. Elena held her tightly, whispering reassurances and stroking her hair as though afraid to let go. Daniel knelt beside them, his own eyes brimming with tears. "Mia," he said softly. "It's Papa. We've missed you so much." Mia lifted her head to look at him, her tears streaking her cheeks. "Papa," she whispered. He nodded, a smile breaking through his emotion. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm here." Mia threw her arms around him, holding on to both her parents as though they might disappear again. The room was silent except for their sobs, the moment too sacred for anyone to interrupt. When the initial wave of emotion had subsided, the family sat together, holding hands as though afraid to let go. Elena and Daniel explained everything they could about what had happened. Years earlier, they had been forced to flee their home due to a financial crisis that had left them homeless. Desperate to protect Mia, they had made the heartbreaking decision to leave her in a safe, public place while they sought help, hoping to return for her within hours. But when they returned to the bus station, Mia was gone. They had searched tirelessly, filing reports and working with authorities, but no one had been able to trace her. "We never stopped looking," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Every day, we prayed that you were safe, that someone kind had taken care of you." Mia listened intently, her small hand never leaving her mother's. "I missed you," she said softly. "But I kept the picture. I hid it in my book so it wouldn't get lost." Elena smiled through her tears, brushing a strand of hair from Mia's face. "You're so brave, my darling. So strong." Over the next few weeks, Mia's parents worked closely with the orphanage to make arrangements for her to return home with them. It was a process filled with paperwork, meetings, and emotional farewells as Mia prepared to leave the only home she had known for years. The staff, while overjoyed for Mia, found it difficult to say goodbye. Mrs. Carter, in particular, struggled with the thought of not seeing Mia in the library every afternoon. On the day of Mia's departure, she handed the girl a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Mrs. Carter smiled. "Open it when you get home," she said. "It's a little something to remind you of us." When Mia finally unwrapped the package, she found a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. Tucked inside was a handwritten note from Mrs. Carter. "Dear Mia," it read, "books may hold memories, but so do the people who love you. This journal is for your new adventures with your family. Fill it with all the wonderful things to come, and never forget how special you are. With love, Mrs. Carter." Mia smiled, her heart full as she hugged the journal to her chest. For the first time in years, she felt whole, a girl with a family, a story, and a future filled with promise. The transition back into life with her parents was both wonderful and overwhelming for Mia. For the first time in years, she was no longer surrounded by the familiar walls of the orphanage or the quiet comfort of the library. Instead, she was stepping into a new world, one filled with warmth, love, and the endless possibilities of family. Elena and Daniel, though overjoyed to have their daughter back, were careful not to rush her. They knew that after everything Mia had been through, she needed time to adjust to the changes. Their home was small but cozy, with light streaming in through the windows and the faint scent of Elena's cooking wafting through the air. It wasn't the house with the red door, too many painful memories lingered there, but it was a home filled with love. Mia's room was decorated with care, her parents having spent days preparing it for her arrival. A bookshelf lined one wall, already half filled with new and secondhand books they had collected in anticipation of her love for reading. A soft quilt, stitched by Elena's hands, covered the bed, and a stuffed bear sat waiting for her on the pillow. "This is your space, sweetheart," Elena said as she showed Mia the room. "You can decorate it however you like. We want you to feel at home." Mia ran her fingers over the quilt, her lips curling into a small smile. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you, Mama." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Mia into a gentle hug. "We're so glad you're here," she whispered. As the days turned into weeks, Mia began to settle into her new life. She enrolled in a nearby school, where she quickly became known as the quiet girl who always had a book in her hands. Her classmates were kind, and though Mia was slow to open up, she found herself enjoying the rhythm of school and the sense of belonging it brought. Her parents, too, worked hard to make up for lost time. Elena loved to bake, and she often invited Mia into the kitchen to help her knead dough or decorate cookies. Daniel, who worked as a carpenter, built Mia a reading nook in the corner of the living room, complete with a cushioned seat and shelves for her favorite books. "Every princess needs her castle," he said with a grin as he finished sanding the wood. "And I think yours will be made of books." Mia giggled, her heart swelling with happiness. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt like she belonged. Despite the joy of being reunited with her family, there were moments when Mia struggled to process everything she had been through. The memories of the orphanage, the years of uncertainty and longing, lingered like shadows in the corners of her mind. At night, she would sometimes lie awake, clutching the photograph of her parents and wondering what her life might have been like if they had never been separated. One evening, as Elena tucked Mia into bed, she noticed the photograph sitting on the nightstand. "Do you want to talk about it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Mia hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the quilt. "Sometimes I feel scared," she admitted. Like you might disappear again." Elena's heart broke at the words, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, taking Mia's hand in hers. "Oh, my darling," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, we're not going anywhere. We're a family now, and nothing will ever change that." Mia looked up at her mother, her eyes wide and searching. "But what if something happens? What if we get separated again?" Elena leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair from Mia's face. "Then we'll find each other, just like we did this time," she said firmly. "No matter what, we'll always find our way back to each other. That's a promise." Mia nodded slowly, her heart steadying at her mother's words. "Okay," she whispered. "I believe you." As time went on, Mia began to open up more about her experiences at the orphanage. She told her parents about Mrs. Carter and the library, about the small treasures she used to hide in the books to hold on to her memories. She even showed them the leather-bound journal Mrs. Carter had given her, now filled with sketches, pressed flowers, and little notes about her new life. One day, Mia asked if they could visit Oakwood Orphanage. "I want to see Mrs. Carter again," she said. "And Mrs. Reynolds, too. I want to show them that I'm okay." Elena and Daniel exchanged a glance before nodding. "Of course," Elena said. "We'd love to meet the people who took such good care of you." The visit was arranged for the following weekend, and Mia could hardly contain her excitement. When they arrived at the orphanage, she ran up the steps and burst into the library, where Mrs. Carter was reshelving books. "Mrs. Carter!" Mia exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. Mrs. Carter turned, her eyes lighting up as she saw the girl she had come to care for so deeply. "Mia," she said, pulling her into a warm embrace. "Oh, my sweet girl, it's so good to see you." They spent the afternoon catching up, with Mia introducing her parents to Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds. The staff were overjoyed to see how happy and healthy Mia was, and they marveled at the transformation in her demeanor. "She's like a whole new person," Mrs. Reynolds said, smiling as she watched Mia chat animatedly with Mrs. Carter. "It's amazing what love can do." The visit to the orphanage marked a turning point for Mia. It gave her a sense of closure, a chance to thank the people who had cared for her during some of the hardest years of her life. As they left that day, Mia felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for her family, but for the journey that had brought her back to them. Back at home, Mia threw herself into her passions with newfound enthusiasm. She joined the school's book club, where she made her first real friends, and she began writing her own stories in the journal Mrs. Carter had given her. Her parents encouraged her every step of the way, marveling at her creativity and determination. "You're going to do great things, Mia," Daniel said one evening as he helped her organize her bookshelf. "I can feel it." Years later, as a young adult, Mia published her first book, a novel inspired by her own life. Titled The Girl with the Red Door, it told the story of a child separated from her family and the journey she took to find her way back to them. The book was met with critical acclaim, with readers praising its heartfelt narrative and powerful message about love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. At the book's launch event, Mia looked out at the crowd and saw her parents sitting in the front row, their eyes shining with pride. Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds were there too, along with some of her old classmates and friends from the orphanage. It was a full-circle moment, one that brought tears to Mia's eyes. As she stepped up to the podium to give her speech, she held the leather-bound journal in her hands, now worn and filled to the brim with memories. "This book wouldn't exist without the people who believed in me," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "To my parents, who never gave up on finding me. To Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds, who showed me kindness when I needed it most. And to everyone who has ever felt lost, this story is for you. Never stop believing in the power of love and hope." The room erupted in applause, and Mia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known as a child. Her story had come full circle, and though it had been marked by pain and uncertainty, it had led her to a place of joy, purpose, and unshakable love. In the months following the release of her book, Mia's life began to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. The success of The Girl with the Red Door brought attention not only to her talent as a writer but also to her incredible story of resilience. Readers from all walks of life reached out to share how her words had moved them, and Mia found herself at the center of conversations about family, hope, and the importance of belonging. One email, in particular, stood out to her. It came from a young girl named Clara, who was living in foster care and had discovered Mia's book through her school library. Clara's message was simple but powerful. "Dear Mia, I read your book, and it made me feel like I'm not alone. I've been in foster care for 2 years, and sometimes it feels like no one understands what it's like. But when I read your story, I felt like you were speaking to me. Thank you for giving me hope." Mia's heart swelled as she read the message. She thought back to her own time at the orphanage, the long days spent feeling invisible and the comfort she had found in books. Clara's words reminded her why she had started writing in the first place, to reach out to others who felt lost, just as she once had. Inspired, Mia decided to respond personally. She wrote back to Clara, sharing words of encouragement and letting her know that she was stronger than she realized. "You are never alone," Mia wrote. "Even when it feels like the world has forgotten you, there are people out there who care and who believe in you. I'm one of them." The exchange with Clara marked the beginning of a new chapter in Mia's life. She realized that her story could be more than just a book. It could be a bridge, connecting her to others who needed to hear her message. With the support of her parents, Mia began visiting schools, libraries, and community centers to share her story and encourage children and teenagers to find their voices. One of her first visits was to Oakwood Orphanage, the place that had shaped so much of her childhood. As she stepped through the familiar doors, memories came rushing back. The quiet hum of the library, the comforting presence of Mrs. Carter, and the bittersweet ache of longing for a family she thought she might never find. The children at the orphanage greeted her with wide eyes and shy smiles, some clutching copies of her book. Mia sat with them in a circle, answering their questions and listening to their stories. Many of them reminded her of herself, quiet, thoughtful, and yearning for connection. One boy, a freckle-faced 10-year-old named Max, raised his hand hesitantly. "Do you think I'll ever find a family?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia's chest tightened, and she took a deep breath before responding. "I think families come in all kinds of shapes and sizes," she said. "Sometimes, they're the people you're born to, and sometimes, they're the people you find along the way. But no matter what, you deserve to be loved and cared for. And I believe that one day, you'll find your place." Max nodded, his expression softening as he tucked her words away. Mia's visits to Oakwood became a regular occurrence. She worked with the staff to start a creative writing program, encouraging the children to express themselves through stories, poems, and drawings. The library, once her sanctuary, became a hub of activity as the children poured their hearts onto the pages. Mrs. Carter watched with pride as Mia guided the children, her voice gentle and encouraging. "You've come so far," she said one afternoon as they shelved books together. "It's amazing to see how you're using your experiences to help others." Mia smiled, her fingers brushing the spine of an old, worn novel. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You gave me a safe place when I needed it most. I want to give that to others." As her outreach efforts grew, Mia found herself connecting with people from all over the world. She began working with organizations that supported children in foster care and orphanages, using her platform to advocate for better resources and opportunities. Her work took her to places she had only dreamed of, small villages, bustling cities, and everything in between. In one remote town, Mia visited an orphanage that had been struggling to provide for its children. The staff were overworked and underfunded, but their dedication was unwavering. Mia spent days with the children, reading to them and helping them create their own stories. One evening, as she sat with a group of girls around a flickering lantern, she asked them what they dreamed of becoming. "A teacher," one girl said. "A pilot," said another. Mia smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You can be anything you want to be," she told them. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The girls nodded, their faces glowing with determination. Mia knew that the road ahead would be challenging for them, but she also knew that they had the strength to overcome it. Back at home, Mia's parents continued to support her every step of the way. Elena often accompanied her on her visits, offering hugs and kind words to the children they met. Daniel used his carpentry skills to build shelves, desks, and other furniture for struggling orphanages and community centers. Their bond as a family grew stronger with each passing day. Though their years apart had been painful, they had found a way to turn that pain into purpose. Together, they were creating a legacy of love and compassion. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Elena placed a hand on Mia's. "You've brought so much light into the world," she said. "We're so proud of you." Mia smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You've taught me what it means to love and to never give up." As the years went on, Mia's work continued to expand. She published more books, each one inspired by the stories of resilience and courage she had encountered on her journey. Her writing touched hearts around the world, and she became a sought-after speaker at conferences and events. But through it all, she remained grounded, always remembering where she had come from. She continued to visit Oakwood Orphanage, where she was greeted as a beloved friend. The library, now thriving thanks to donations sparked by Mia's advocacy, had become a place of inspiration for generations of children. One day, as she walked through the familiar rows of books, she paused at a shelf filled with old, worn volumes. She ran her fingers over the spines, memories flooding back. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace, a reminder that even the smallest moments could lead to something extraordinary. Mia turned to Mrs. Carter, who was busy arranging a display of new arrivals. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" she asked. Mrs. Carter smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Every day," she said. "And I wouldn't change a thing." As the years passed, Mia's life became a delicate balance between her advocacy work and her personal growth. She traveled to cities and towns around the world, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned. But no matter how far she went, she always found her way back home, to her parents, to Oakwood Orphanage, and to the community that had helped her become who she was. One day, while working on her third book in her cozy reading nook, Mia received a surprising letter. It was written in elegant handwriting on thick, cream-colored paper, and the return address indicated it came from a prestigious university. Her curiosity piqued. Mia opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Ms. Mia Carter, your book, The Girl with the Red Door, has been a source of inspiration to countless readers, particularly within our institution. As a university dedicated to fostering social justice and creative expression, we would be honored if you would deliver the keynote speech at our upcoming annual conference on the theme, The Power of Storytelling to Change Lives. Your journey of resilience and advocacy has deeply touched many of our students and faculty, and we believe your words will have a profound impact on all who attend. Please let us know if you are available for this opportunity. We eagerly await your response. With gratitude, Dr. Meredith Lawson, Dean of Arts and Humanities." Mia stared at the letter, her mind racing. A keynote speech at a university? It was an honor she hadn't expected, but the thought of speaking to a large audience made her palms sweat. Public speaking had never come easily to her, despite her many appearances at schools and community events. That evening, she shared the news with her parents over dinner. Elena's face lit up with pride, while Daniel beamed and clapped a hand on her shoulder. "You've been ready for this moment for a long time," he said. "Your words have always had the power to move people." "But what if I mess up?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Elena reached across the table and took her hand. "Mia, your story comes from the heart. That's what matters." Speak your truth and the rest will follow. Mia spent the next few weeks preparing for the speech, poring over old journals, photographs, and letters to find the right words to convey her message. She wanted to do justice to the theme of storytelling, to show how it had shaped her life and connected her to others. The day of the conference arrived, and Mia found herself standing backstage, her heart pounding as she listened to the applause for the previous speaker. She clutched her note cards tightly, reminding herself of her mother's words, "Speak your truth, and the rest will follow." When her name was announced, Mia stepped onto the stage to a thunderous ovation. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, and guests, their faces turned toward her with anticipation. She took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and began. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "It's an honor to be here with you today. When I was a little girl, I found solace in stories. They were my escape, my comfort, and my way of holding on to the memories I was afraid to lose. But what I didn't realize at the time was that stories aren't just something we read, they're something we live. Each of us has a story, and each story has the power to change the world." As she spoke, Mia shared pieces of her journey, the red door, the orphanage, and the photograph that had sparked her search for her family. She talked about the people who had shaped her life, from Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Reynolds to her parents and the children she had met along the way. "But the most important lesson I've learned," she said, her voice growing stronger, "is that stories connect us. They remind us that we're not alone, that our struggles and triumphs are shared by others. And when we share our stories, we create a bridge, a way to reach across the divide and say, 'I see you. I understand.'" The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Mia felt a surge of confidence as she continued, her passion carrying her through the speech. When she finished, the applause was so loud and so long that she felt tears welling up in her eyes. For the first time, she truly understood the impact her story had on others. After the conference, Mia was approached by dozens of students, each eager to share their own experiences and thank her for her words. One young woman, a journalism major named Kayla, stood out in particular. "I've always wanted to write stories that make a difference," Kayla said, her eyes shining with determination. "Hearing you speak today reminded me why I chose this path. Thank you for inspiring me." Mia smiled, her heart full. "The world needs your voice," she said. "Don't be afraid to use it." The months following the conference were a whirlwind. Mia's work gained even more recognition, and she found herself balancing book tours, speaking engagements, and her ongoing advocacy projects. But despite her busy schedule, she never forgot her roots. She continued visiting Oakwood Orphanage, where the creative writing program she had started was thriving. One afternoon, Mrs. Carter pulled Mia aside and handed her a small box wrapped in brown paper. "I've been saving this for you," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I thought it might mean something now." Mia opened the box to find an old, worn book, the same one she had hidden the photograph in all those years ago. Inside, tucked between the pages, was the photograph itself, now preserved in a protective sleeve. "I thought you might want to keep it," Mrs. Carter said. "It's where your story began, after all." Mia held the book close to her chest, her eyes misting with tears. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." As Mia's life continued to evolve, she began to dream bigger. She envisioned a foundation that would provide resources, scholarships, and mentorship programs for children in foster care and orphanages. With the support of her parents and a team of dedicated advocates, she launched the Red Door Foundation, named in honor of the home that had always symbolized hope and belonging. The foundation quickly gained traction, becoming a beacon of support for vulnerable children around the world. Mia worked tirelessly to ensure that every child who came through its doors felt seen, valued, and loved. One day, as she stood in the lobby of the foundation's headquarters, Mia watched as a group of children filed in for a workshop. Their laughter and excitement filled the space, reminding her of why she had started this journey. "You've built something incredible," Elena said, joining her daughter. "I hope you're proud of yourself." Mia smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I am," she said. "But I couldn't have done it without you and Papa. You gave me the strength to believe in myself." In the years that followed, Mia continued to write, advocate, and build connections. Her story became a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. And though her journey had been filled with challenges, it had also led her to a place of joy, purpose, and hope, a place where she could truly say she belonged.